Hello, my name is Owen, and welcome back to our Malazan Book of the Fallen reread. We are on Book 5, Midnight Tides. We are on Part 2, Prowls of the Day. And for those of you joining me for the first time, I spoil everything from here, Part 2 of Midnight Tides, backward. All right, we'll talk about this in the context of the entire series. So if you haven't read any Malazan books, I encourage you to check it out. But occasionally I'll make videos about like the foreshadowing in this book for like the end game of the series, because this is a reread after all. But in videos like this, I do not talk about future books. So feel free to go through the playlist and watch these videos in sequential order as you're reading along the series. You could watch my thoughts on each individual part. I make videos for most of the parts, not every part, but for most of the parts. They each get their own separate video, and it's good stuff. In fact, some would say it's great stuff, and I have a lot of fun doing it. But Part 2 of Midnight Tides, we're kind of done with the introduction phase. We know all the players in this story. We know the Bedek brothers. We know the Sengar brothers. We know the Lethari Empire. We know the Tisti-Dur and their little tribe of people going on. And we know that tensions are rising between the two people. We know that the Lethari Empire is an empire of greed. They cannot afford compassion, which compassion we know is a running theme in this series. And those who have a lack of it tend to be the bad guys, or at least they're on the wrong path. So we know the Lethari Empire is kind of this setup, and there's this tribe. They're kind of the underdogs, but they got this strange ruler, Hanan Mosag, who's kind of got he's got dark powers. We don't know where he's getting it from, so he's a little suspect, right? That's where we left off Part 1. Part 2 starts off, and I think I mentioned this in the last video. That's because I read slightly ahead the last video. But this chapter starts with Brys Bedek kind of entering this strange dimension, right? And he encounters this forgotten god, and he's like, they've forgotten our names, and they've stolen our names, and the Dur have corrupted them. They've corrupted us, or these gods, and taken their power, which obviously sounds, in the context of this specific scene, it's a horrible misdeed of some kind. So we know kind of a little bit more about Hanan Mosag's like power set, I guess. He's kind of using a corrupted magic sense of some sort. So we'll get even a little bit more wary of him. But there's this great scene where Brys decides that I will remember your names. And he takes upon this sacrifice. He gives the god his blood. And in the context of this scene, it's a very noble thing to do. I don't know if remembering every god in the Malazan universe would be considered a good thing, but in the context of this specific scene, we get the sense that this was a very noble and brave, compassionate thing for Brys to do here. So that's kind of where we start. From then on, it's mostly Sengar for the remainder of this part. Mosag sends the Sengar brothers on a quest to retrieve a magic sword, and he says, no touching. No touching, you bring it back to me, you do not touch the sword. And they're like, okay, sounds good. So all the brothers, including the unblooded Rulad Sengar, they all go off on this quest. So that's the majority of it. Obviously, things go awry. Rulad dies. So sad, so sad. And then we really get into the meat of this part, in my opinion. And this is all just a recap, but some of my favorite parts of Malazan is when we get like some of the horror elements, or just some of like the real creepy bits that like make your skin crawl. And I think in the entire 10-book series, Rulad's resurrection scene is one of the most iconic and haunting parts of the entire series. The fact that like his body is embedded with all these coins as like a burial process, and he wakes up like during that, and they're just burned into his flesh, and he just woke up screaming and blinded by these coins, and poor Eudenus is just kind of stuck there dealing with the mess. Absolutely bone-chilling scene. And I absolutely love it when Erikson gives us a taste of that horror stuff, and literally no better scene, perhaps. I'm just gonna say it. No creepier, no more disturbing, no more like new phobia unlocked type scene than that. Like being, I don't know what context I would be, have coins like burned into my skin. But if I was dead, like, don't do that to me, right? Like, let's just chop my head off first, and then you can do some weird stuff as a burial process. Because if I sign a pact with the crippled god, I don't want to be coming back with coins embedded into my eyeballs. That sounds, quite frankly, not very pleasant. But that's an important part, right? We learn, it's kind of implied because we know in the prologue, or I don't know if you know it's a prologue, but in a very early chapter of Part 1, that the crippled god is making this sword. It is the same sword. Hanan Mosag was working with the crippled god, although he planned to betray him. Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? You're working with the crippled god, but you plan to betray him? I don't know if two wrongs make a right there. But the crippled god says, Mosag ain't it, bro. You're it. And you are my chosen champion. He comes back and he says that we're going to start the Edur Empire, which if we remember from part one, they read the tiles back in the Lethari Empire and they're like, or the Lethari Kingdom, and they're like, the Lethari is going to be an empire, right? So another empire started up, or is it connected? Let's think about this for a little bit. As the delegation gets closer, tensions start to rise. The prince of the Lethari Empire arrives, and he's got his advisor, who's not a character I remembered, but kind of a badass. The first eunuch. He's very politically savvy. I like his dialogue. I was like reading his scenes and like, who is this guy and why is he so charming? But he's kind of like the spokesperson. He's the real voice of reason here. The prince is just a spoiled brat. But they're getting there right as Rulad takes control and says like, Anan Mosag, dude, you're out, I'm in. And then like he bows to him. And like all the Edur rally around this new emperor. You gotta get there right as that, and the tension in Hull Bedek's there, and he's ready to make a move. He's blood brothers with Binidas, so he's connected to the Sengars, but the Sengars are now the emperor. But Troll is kind of on the back foot there. There's a great scene in this, and I'm just jumping all over the place in this because we're just chatting about the awesomeness that happened. There's a great scene after Rulad's death where Troll kind of has this like almost baptism through combat where he's fighting the Jack Soul Taken as like attacking him, and like he comes out of that, I would say maybe not 100% transformed, but very, very close to fully transformed to his character that we see in House of Chains. This kind of like realizing the corruption of his people, realizing things have gone astray somewhere. After that scene, he's fully dialed into the fact that everything that is happening to his people is wrong in some way, and he can't quite put his finger on why yet. There's a great piece of dialogue where he's talking about the Jack, and he's like, I thought soul taking was this holy thing, like from like the ancient gods bestowed upon like the most holy followers, but like how could the Jek have this power? How could the Jek have this holy power that, and even we consider them like blasphemous, like below human, or I guess below Tist Edur type species? He's kind of coming to grips with the fact that like maybe his people are at the pinnacle, maybe doubting them, maybe start thinking about like the history of the Edur. Because we know obviously their whole culture is kind of built on this lie of the betrayal of Silch's ruin by Scavendary Bloodeye. So that's kind of a recurring theme there. It's kind of Troll awakening in that regard. But there's another very disturbing scene where Rulad becomes emperor and he finally steals Fear Sengar's wife, which Troll has been warning us about the whole time, but they thought he was crazy, but he stole his wife. And like she's like, yeah, I'm his wife. And I'm like, nah, what a loser. What a horrible character. You're a horrible person, Mayan. And then she goes like, I'm horrified. She makes that face. And then there's a great line from Udinus who says like, that saved everybody there, because everybody knew that Rulad was insane and he was so powerful that they couldn't really say no to him in that moment. But the fact that she wasn't a part of the plan, that she didn't know this was going to happen, and she shows like genuine fear, saved this people from like total and utter collapse because she didn't buy into it, which I thought was a very poetic moment. I feel like that first of all, that Udinus made that observation, just that like, but such a small moment like saves them from total collapse. The fact that like she has some humanity and she does feel bad that she's abandoning fear, but she knows this is her only option. When the crazy emperor with the magic sword says, "You're my wife now, you better smile." That's kind of what happens there. But that's really the highlights of what we got going on in this part. Another highlight, though, real quick, with the Bedek brothers, Tehol he keeps up to his hijinks, and there's some stuff going on there. But there's a great scene as well where Brees is talking about like he gets warnings from the other people in the high up in the power, where they're like, "Hey, your brother Hull, he's a dangerous boy. We're probably gonna have to kill him." And Brees feels his family obligation to protect his brother, but doesn't want to go against the king. And Tehol's like, "Listen, dude, you're the king's champion. You protect the king. You do what you're doing. You're an honorable man. I'll protect Hull because I got no such rules chaining me down." Which, for as comedic and silly of a character that Tehol is, he is very scary and very intimidating, and you do not want to be on his bad side. And he kind of sends Shirk Ilal on this heist Jaron Eberich's mansion or estate or whatever, which we still don't know like where Tehel's plan is going in. So like while there's some scenes with him, we don't really know where that's going at, what his master plan is. We just know that he's cooking something. We know that he's cooking. So that's really the overview of the events that happen, right? That's just the base events. What I really want to talk about, what I always want to talk about, is the exploration of themes, right? I feel like watching or reading part one and rewatching my part one video, I wasn't very clear on the themes yet. I didn't have a good idea of what it was. And as a base, I think for part two in general, I have a lot clearer idea of what Steven Erikson is trying to do with this book. Because as I said in videos past, it seems very clear that each book has its own individual theme that not only supports the end game of the book or of the series, which I'm not going to talk about, but they're all distinct, but they all like work together and they all build upon each other, which I think is just such fantastic writing. And in terms of previous books, there are echoes of similar themes. Obviously, the theme of compassion and the importance of it, and the fact that the Lethari Empire says they cannot afford compassion implies that they are inherently bad. That's just like a very basic compassion theme that runs throughout the entire series. But there's also kind of an echoing of the themes of like Dead House Gates and by extension House of Chains, of this like repeating the past type thing, and like historians and like forgetting your mistakes of your past. Obviously with like the Edur and like their misremembering of the betrayal of the Edur of the Tistandi and their battle. Their whole culture is built on like we were betrayed by the Tistandi, and they don't realize that like it was their mistake. They forgot the history, and in that regard, it kind of made me think of the Jagged who froze the entire scene. Kind of acted as like the historian of it. It's like I'm going to preserve like this moment, so to learn from it in the future. And then it's also just like, I still think it's so fascinating that this culture is built in this lie, because then obviously characters in this part start to learn that the ghosts or the wraiths that haunt like their nearby like isn't Edur, it's actually Andi. So they're kind of like haunted by their past there. But that's just kind of like the echoing of it. It's more of like a parallel theme, because of what the real theme of this book is, and I'm very, very excited to have stumbled upon this perhaps. It's about forgetting. It's about but not forgetting like history, not forgetting events. What this book is about, and this is why it's an echoing or a parallel theme to the Dead House Gates, House of Chains type narrative there. It is about forgotten people in this book. And I think that's interesting because in books previous, when we're talking about like remembering or forgetting, it's in the context of like entire continents or entire cultures. When we're talking about the Seven Cities, like this entire continent who's doomed to repeat its history endlessly. This is about forgotten people. And something that I realize is that this book has a lot of characters, of like POV characters who are forgotten in one way or another, and also just references forgotten people a lot. And just get some of the most general ones out of the way first. A lot of the cultures that the Lethari kingdom has conquered, like the Narek or like the people that they have indentured servitude to, like those that are massively in debt. These are like a lower class of people in the society, and they're kind of looked over in that way. And that's why someone like Hull feels so betrayed that this culture of people, the Narek that he befriended, kind of becomes this lower class form of slave. And there's many slaves in the story, like those indentured servants in the Lethari kingdom, but then also in the Edur camps, there's characters like Featherwitch and Udinus who are literally slaves, literally a lower class or an overlooked class of people. So this is kind of like the general groups of people who could be considered forgotten. But remember how we started this part of the book with Brees, and he's going into this realm, and like I said, it's presented as him deciding to remember the names of these people, and giving that blood sacrifice is a very noble thing, because like if you were remembering or rather if you were forgetting like a god like the crippled god, that would be a good thing in the context of the universe because he's such an evil dastardly figure, but the way Erikson presents it, it's very obvious that this is a good thing to remember those that are forgotten. That's how we start the part, and that's kind of got my brain turning about how that would appear in later parts. But then I thought about like the slaves and the Narek, and then I thought about the POV characters. And Tehel is a great example of someone who understands like the plight of the everyman in some cases, but he knows the power that someone that's forgotten has, or rather like how overlooked they are, because obviously he's someone who's very smart. He knows how to get his way, and he has this grand plan to collapse the Theri economy, but he's very, very deliberate in trying to stay as under the radar as possible because he knows how overlooked the lower class is. And that's something like his whole shtick of like sleeping on the roof, not wearing pants, like so that people underestimate him and think of him as in association with these forgotten class of people. It's like constantly, especially in the context of the Theri kingdom, it's the people that we focus on are not like the king's not the most important character. The royal advisor is not the most important character. The queen's not the most important character. And even though there are these Game of Thrones type politics constantly going on, some of which are intriguing, we don't really fully dive into them because Erikson is trying to tell us that like it is the people that will play the most important role in the story. With Tejo understanding that and kind of using that to his advantage in terms of his scheme. And then also there's the Sengar brothers, right? And if we think about them in terms of this context of this theme, Rulad is such a fascinating character if we think about like the idea of like a forgotten person, because he's the youngest brother, he's the unblooded, he has the most to prove. So in that way, it makes him the perfect candidate for the crippled god to like take up this mantle of the Idur emperor, because he had so much to prove and he knew he was overlooked by his brothers. And it was kind of just like the perfect storm for him to take this mantle, and he's so desperate to be remembered that he does this drastic evil thing by aligning himself with the crippled god. And in some ways as well, Troll is a forgotten class of character because he's like, in the context of their family at least, he's the middle brother. Constantly in part one, he's being like kind of discarded. His concerns are kind of being brushed aside, whether it's about Rulad and fear or just in general. He's not really respected as much as someone like Fear would be, which I think is interesting in the context of the two brothers, which is something that I feel like Erikson does a lot, specifically with the crippled god's involvement in a lot of things. This happened a little bit in the past. It'll happen more in future books as well. But he always uses the crippled god very interestingly in the terms of people, not in all cases. Like there's some people in the whirlwind camp who are just pure evil, but a lot of people that align with the crippled god. It's kind of, they're given the same choice as a lot of like our more heroic characters, like our trolls of the world, where both him and Rulad, I consider both like, they're overlooked in some ways. But Rulad chose to take up this evil mantle in order to be remembered, whereas we know a character like Troll would never do that, even though he could be considered also forgotten, overlooked in some ways. It's just, he's just more compassionate. He's more concerned about others than he is about himself. So he would never in a million years take over the role of the Idur emperor. It's just not in the cards for him. But Erikson does a great thing where it's like, even though Rulad is making the evil decision, in a lot of ways we feel bad for him. And especially it's like the gruesomeness of his like revival scene kind of contributes to that, like how sad it really is that this is happening to this character. But he's really like, something we have to remember about him is that he is a kid. And in his final moments to grab the sword, maybe he knew it was magic, maybe he knew it was powerful, but he was really just trying to prove before he died that he could be a blooded warrior, which is kind of like tragic in a way. It would have been tragic like if he had just straight up died, but it's even more tragic that he gets to come back alive as this even more powerful, twisted version of himself, because all he was trying to do is prove himself to his brothers. And I just love stuff like that where it's like, no, not everyone is just a straight 100% villain. And I think it's kind of makes me think of Karsa Orlong in a lot of ways, someone who embraced the crippled god for a little bit. And even though he wasn't very sympathetic in the beginning, he kind of has like the reverse Rulad arc where he starts less sympathetic and becomes more sympathetic, and he like brushes off the crippled god. Whereas maybe Rulad, well, he's a little bit like of a brat. He's kind of annoying. He's definitely flirting with his brother's wife. He becomes more evil when he takes up the crippled god. And I just think it's a tragedy in a lot of ways for him. But so those are kind of like the POV characters, right? But then I also was thinking, and this is where we get very interesting, guys. let me ask you this. Do we remember what the series of these books, hold on, let me rephrase that. Do we remember what this series of books is called? Malazan, Book of the Fallen. This is the Book of the Fallen. Sometimes we look at it so long that we forget what those words mean. And I was reminded of this because Eudenus has a great little speech there where he talks about like the fallen, right? I think he's talking about it in the context of like the wraiths, which is like, oh, like they're the fallen. So you think it's like the respectful of the Idra dead, and no, it's the dead of the Andi. But this whole series is about the fallen people that make up this story, right? It's telling their story and how important they really were in terms of the entire series' events playing out. And it's just a reminder of like what this series really is. It's kind of the chronicling of these characters because of how important they are. But maybe if you were living in this world, you wouldn't think of like a character like Troll to be super important in the end game. That's something to think of wide scale. But just made me think about also as well, who's more forgotten than the dead? And this is where things get very, very interesting, because in reading part 1, a character like Shirk Ilal kind of threw me for a loop. I'm like, I don't really know her thematic significance. I don't really know what her role to play is. And it's kind of weird, this kind of style of necromantic magic that's kind of been introduced in this book. There's a lot of characters who are like corpses, and not in like the Tlanamas way, but like in a very like, I'm dead, I'm a human, but I'm dead, but I'm alive type way. Like it's very in your face. It's like, these are humans that were dead and now they're alive for some reason, because Shirk Ilal is like that, Kettle is like that, Charon's brother who's in the estate is like that, and Tehel, being one who knows the power of someone forgotten, uses Shirk to his full advantage, and he gets a lot of help from Kettle, also someone who is forgotten. So like having this idea of like the dead, like once you're gone, like no one really thinks about you, making them personified and actually do important things in this story is like an in your face, hey, this is about forgotten people and the power that they have. So it's kind of more like if Erickson like slapping us in the face, being like, hey, look at this dead person who you wouldn't think would be able to do important things because they're dead. They're doing important things. So maybe you think about every single character that's unimportant or forgotten about. This is not about kings. This is about the most base level of characters, the most overlooked characters. And I think it's interesting. It's like we're kind of seeing many different ways that can play out. We have Tahel, who knows that power of being forgotten, so he tries to stay forgotten. We have a character on the flip side of that, like Roulette, knows the pain of being forgotten and does everything in his power to be remembered. And that's why the crippled god discards of Hanan Mosag so easily, because he's not as concerned necessarily with the power. He's not as insecure about that. So he knows, the crippled god knows that he can't easily manipulate Mosag as he could someone like Roulette. So every single character who has an important role to play is in some ways related to this forgotten in their life, in their family, or a lower class. And then another great reason, or example of this rather, is like Roulette becomes obviously the emperor, right? Now you can't say he's a forgotten character, right? His actions were spurned on by that fact. But his right-hand man immediately from his resurrection becomes Eudenus the slave. And he kind of has this secret rival hidden inside him that he's got to keep under wraps and stuff, but it's instantly elevated this slave base level character into someone who will play a very important role in this story. And I just think it's fascinating. Like once you think of it that way, it's like, what class are these characters, or are they dead, or do they represent the death? Like what are their interactions with society around them? They are all of this same class. And I think it poses an interesting question, because kind of like I talked about in the first part, where it's like in a normal blockbuster film, the Idura Empire or the Idura tribes would be the heroes because they're fighting up against the evil capitalist society, the Letheri Empire. They're going to run up against them. They're going to win the day. They're going to win the war. It's that, but it's twisted, because there's two paths you can take when you're a forgotten person in society. You can be bigger than it, and you can become better. Like maybe Troll is kind of becoming aware of that, and he's going to evolve into the hero and the great guy that we know him to be. Or you can take the path of Roulette and try to burn it all down. And we kind of see both ends of that spectrum, and then even like a Tehel's kind of a flip on that, because he wants to burn it all down, but does he really want to burn it all down, or does he want to help the people, just bring down the elite? And then like Hull is an example of that too. He kind of wants to burn it all down because he wants to start a war, but he's a good guy. So there's all these people who are doing very, very similar things: Tehel, Rulad, Hull, and they're doing the same things but different ways, right? And it kind of explores. It makes things less or more gray, less clear cut in a lot of ways. But we know that the characters with the most compassion are always our moral compasses. So we got to gravitate to someone like Tehel, who we know treats people with compassion in a lot of ways. We know that Hull's backstory is really contributed to his compassion towards the Narek and his friends who he feels like was betrayed. And that's what makes it slightly differently. It's like the motivations behind the actions of Rulad. We know the crippled god is up to some deep, dark, dastardly stuff. And yet we still feel bad for Rulad because it's kind of a tragic arc there. And it's just good stuff too. And then going back even to Kettle a little bit, it's another dead character, but what she interacts with a lot is these grounds of the Azath house, right? And going back to like the dead are forgotten, there's also the buried are forgotten in a lot of ways. And we've been told since the very prologue that the Azath house is ready to burst. That's coming closer and closer. She keeps saying like, hey, they're getting closer to clawing out. These creatures will be forgotten. Certainly the city is not prepared for these ultra powerful beings to start popping out of the earth. That's another literal example of these are forgotten in this context of the world, and it's going to be very important very soon. So all these characters are going to play out, and then we kind of leave this part on the cliffhanger of Rulad becoming emperor, and he's ready to. It seems like war is inevitable at this point because he just wants. He just doesn't respect the Letharies at all. So it just seems like we're set up for a very bombastic later parts in this book. But I'm excited to see how this forgotten people aspect plays out in later books. I really, really think I'm right. There's too many characters that fit this theme for it not to play out. And also, I've read the book before, so I kind of know what happens. But just the idea of like, what can these forgotten people do when society pushes them down like that? Because again, like we realized in part one, the Lethari kingdom is the bad guys. They are the bad guys. They cause a lot of issues in the way, but that doesn't mean that everybody fighting against them is doing it the right way, which makes it more nuanced, makes it more interesting, makes it more of a great read. I don't know if that made any sense, but I certainly yapped a lot. Be sure to let me know in the comments below. Did I make any sense? And what do you guys think of part 2 of Midnight Tides? What do you guys think of Midnight Tides in general? I think it's a fantastic book, very approachable, and I can't wait to continue reading it. So be sure to like and subscribe if you like the video and you want to see more like in the future. And as always, thank you for sticking around.